Morning folks, I'm Dave Canterbury with Self-Reliance Outfitters in the Pathfinder School. And what I thought we'd do today in our Materia Medica series is divert just a little bit from the norm of going out, looking at a plant or tree, talking about the constituents of that plant, and then talking about possible uses for that plant or tree. And divert ourselves today to actually making an infusion that's an expectorant, which we'll call the Woodsman's expectorant. We're going to use goldenrod for this infusion, which is a very good antiseptic as well as an expectorant type plant that has a fairly long growing season. So it's available for about 7-8 months out of the year here in Ohio to be used. But really the best time to use the goldenrod as an expectorant is when it's flowering. So you really only have about a 5-month period right there that you can use goldenrod, which goes right back to what I said about the trees being a 4-season resource. But for an infusion, you want soft type plant matters. You can use some roots for infusions, but for the most part, once you get to inner barks and roots, you're going to want to do a decoction. So today, we're going to talk about an infusion of goldenrod called the Woodsman's expectorant. Stay with me. One thing that we should understand at the onset of this infusion is that infusions are very powerful medicinal preparations for the Woodsman. For thousands of years, people have been using simple infusions and decoctions to use medicinal properties of plants either internally or externally. And it's only been recently, within the last 100 years, that we've got this big movement in the herbal industry to tinctures and refining the chemical properties within a plant and things like that. And James Green talks about that quite a bit in his book, The Medicine Maker's Handbook. And this is a very good book, and I would recommend it if you're going to start making herbal preparations. This book goes into a lot of in-depth study and discussion about all the different ways to prepare herbs. So, understanding that we have a very powerful action in an infusion. The other thing that we need to think about is why infusions are so good and why we talk about them as being something that's so great for the Woodsman. Well, one thing is they're simple. It doesn't take anything but the raw herb and hot water to make the infusion. Remember that once we synthesize chemicals from a plant to make a drug, a pharmaceutical grade drug, we basically are isolating one chemical from that plant, or one constituent from that plant, is probably a better word, that treats one certain thing. And we're getting rid of everything else. And plants are nature's way of giving you medicine, and they balance themselves out within your body because they have lots of inert properties that we don't get rid of if we use them in their natural state that help them to be more usable within your body. And a good example of that would be something like aspirin, where if you take aspirin a lot and it's non-buffered, it can eat the lining of your stomach. But willow bark, which has the same chemical salicin that is refined into aspirin, we can take willow bark till our heart's content with no side effects. And that's the whole key to that refined drug scenario, are the side effects versus the whole herb with few to no side effects. And I think that's an important thing for us to understand. But for us as woodsmen, what we need to understand is that by using the whole plant, we get the whole medicine. And that's why we can take certain plants and use them for lots and lots of different things, because there's lots of chemical constituents within that plant, or lots of healing properties within that plant that may not only address one thing, they address several. And the goldenrod is a good example of that we're going to use today, because it's an expectorant, it's antiseptic, it's a styptic, so it's good to stop bleeding on the surface of your skin. If you have like capillary or bright red blood bleeding, if you have dark red blood bleeding or heavy bleeding, you want to go to a yarrow. But understanding the different things that these plants will do for us allows us to utilize them as if we had a medicine cabinet in just a very few plants. And again, James Green talks about the very few plant theory in his book, and I teach that in the Pathfinder system all the way back to when we developed phase 1 of the Pathfinder system. We talked about learning 8 plants very, very well that are common in your area that have no poison lookalikes. And if you learn 8 to 10 plants that are local to you, and I would say add 5 trees to that, and you know them inside and out, what you can use them for, you've got a powerful medicine cabinet at hand as a woodsman to just walk out and pluck when you need it. Okay, for any infusion, you're really going to need 2 containers with lids. You're going to need one that you can boil water in, and one that you can use to pour hot water over the herb whether you trap that herb in something like a bag or a bandana, or whether you just put it loose into the container. So I've got 2 bush pots here, one bigger than the other. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use one bush pot to get my water over the fire, and I'm going to use the other bush pot to make my herbal. So the bush pot that I'm going to use to make my herbal, I'm going to set aside. Then I'm going to get my materials out here that I'm going to use really quick to work on my herbal with. I've got several goldenrod tops here, and this is really what I want, are the tops of this plant for something like this. And I'm going to just cut them up as fine as my patience will allow me to do it. In other words, there's no set rule to this as far as how fine it has to be. But the more surface area I can expose in this plant, the easier it's going to be to draw out what I want from the plant. And that's important to understand. So cut this thing up as fine as you can. Get your fines out of the way. The tops are really what you're after. You want to make sure anytime you pick a bunch of plants like this that you don't have any other plants mixed in, because that can be bad news. It can also give you, make things happen to you that you didn't plan on happening and you don't understand why. So it's really important that you make sure you're only using the plant that you chose, so that when you have reactions to the plant and your body reacts to the plant, you understand why it's doing that. That's important. All right, so we can just get rid of the rest of this. And this portion of an infusion is called the mark, or a decoction, or a tincture. This is called the mark. And the menstruum is what we're going to use to extract the nutrients from the mark, or the chemical properties, the healing properties from the mark. In this case, we're going to use water. Once we've got our water on the boil and it's getting heated up, we can just go through here and make sure that we've got this as finely chopped down as we can get it. If we see any bigger pieces in there, we can break them up with our fingers. What we're going to need to do with this is we're going to need to let this steep. What that means is we're going to leave this pot away from the fire. We're going to bring the boiling water over and pour it over the mark, and then cover it with a lid and let it steep for a certain contact time. And that really depends on experience on your part, but a good rule of thumb is 15 to 20 minutes. 15 to 20 minutes, you should have everything drawn out of that plant. Now, there's a couple things you can do here to either make it easy or hard. If you're doing this on the fly, you're doing it really quick, you don't have a lot of stuff to play with, you can just put your mark inside the pot, pour it over the top of it, and then strain it off into a drinking cup or something like that. You could also wrap this in a material like a bandana, tie it off and put the bandana in the pot, pour the hot water over top of that and seal it. And that way you don't have to strain anything off, you can just pour liquid straight from the pot. You could also use some type of a canvas bag like the ones that I've got in what I'm calling the Woodsman's Apothecary. We talked about that a little bit yesterday, and what I did with that, and again, this is not a kit that I'd be carrying short term. So in the short term, I'd be doing something like this, or using a bandana. But in a longer term scenario, I can make it a little bit better on myself, or easier on myself, by taking like a canvas reusable bag like this one that I can wash, and filling this with the mark, and using this as a tea bag to drop into the water. And it doesn't hurt to just let that thing float on top of the water, because displacement will soak that up and it will sink to the bottom. And that'll give you a pretty good indicator of, hey, I've extracted everything out of that herb that I'm going to get out of it. So you can do it that way as well. There's really no specifics in it. It just has to be pretty much, the hot water has to contact the mark, and it has to draw out the good properties within that herb that you want to ingest into your system. Again, this is antiseptic and it's an expectorant, so it's going to make you cough. It's going to be an antiseptic in your throat, your larynx, and down into your digestive system, so that's a good thing because you want that. And you could also just use it for a gargle if you had a sore throat because of its antiseptic properties. So goldenrod's a really, really good plant to understand, and it's really one of my top 10. Goldenrod's in the top 10 of plants that I use a lot. Now, let's get some hot water over here and pour it in. We just really want enough to cover the plant, and then we want a lid on it. Okay, so while we're steeping this herb in here, let's talk a little bit about this Woodsman's Apothecary, because we drug a couple items out of that we talked about we could use to make infusions. And we also have honey in here, so we could use that to sweeten this infusion so it's not so harsh when we drink it. Let's put it that way. There's a goldenrod, most green, dry plants that have some astringency in them, which is what makes this plant such a good styptic, is the tannin astringency of the plant. Most of those type of plants have a bite when you drink them. And you can alleviate some of that with honey or sugar out of an MRE if you had it. But in this case, I'm carrying honey so I can use it. The Woodsman's Apothecary is really not meant to be something that we use all the time. It is a kit that we carry in a longer term plan scenario that gives us some quick herbals on the fly if we can't wildcraft. We're supposed to wildcraft these herbs anytime we can to utilize them as fresh as possible, and that's what we did with the goldenrod. So in a scenario like this, I'm going to conserve the resources that I would use normally from this kit, like the white oak bark and things like that, that are already dried and ground. Those are emergency items. I'm saving those because I've got something right here available that I can use for the exact same thing. I might have to use a little honey out of here, but I can replace that when I get back home from the scout or the trip or whatever I'm doing and have it ready for the next time. Okay, so now that we've let this infusion set for about 15 minutes, we can go ahead and strain it off into a drinking vessel or a cup. You're going to drink about 8 ounces of this 3 to 4 times a day. The other advantage, in my mind, to something like a decoction or an infusion is that you're actually ingesting water at the same time you're trying to ingest the medicinal properties of this plant. So you're hydrating your body, which is very important, especially with illnesses anyway. And in any scenario that might become an emergency, if you are hydrating, you're doing something right. So that's another side benefit of this, drinking this infusion or a decoction of any sort, is that you're hydrating your body at the same time you're trying to add medicinal value. So now what we're going to do is we're going to treat this as if we were doing this in an emergency, and we're going to just take some kind of a t-shirt or a cotton rag and put it over our cup, and we're going to pour our infusion into that. And this filtration will just catch any of the flower tops and stems and things like that that might be in there still. And you'll just have to kind of peek under there and see how full you've got things as you go. We're pretty full now. Okay, so there's a full cup of strained infusion of goldenrod. Okay, so one thing we should discuss real quick, just as a side note, is that once we get to the point where we understand the constituents of different herbs and what they'll do for us and for our bodies, and we have picked our 10 and we know them inside and out, we can then begin to create formulas, or triangle formulas as they were called, to attack certain symptoms that we've got. And in this case, if we're trying to get rid of a cold scenario where we've got a stuffy head, we've got some mucus in there that we can't get out, things like that, what I would probably do is I would combine the goldenrod with mullein as well as yarrow. And I would mix those 3 herbs in equal amounts, most likely, chop them up, and add them to the pot. About 1 cup of chopped herb to a half a bush pot of water, which is about what we did with the goldenrod. And this is just a Kapilka cup. I like to use Kapilka stuff for measuring because I carry it a lot. So I use a full Kapilka cup as a measurement. I use a Kapilka gill cup as a measurement, and I use a Kapilka spoon as a measurement because I carry the gill cup and the spoon inside my apothecary, and I've generally got the Kapilka cup on my belt somewhere or on my haversack. So I use those as my measurement devices. You can choose what you're going to use for your own. So in this case, we took about a Kapilka cup of the herb, the fresh herb, to about a half a bush pot of water. And if I were going to make a triangle formula, I would use equal amounts of those 3 herbs that we discussed, the yarrow, the mullein, and the goldenrod, to make that same 1 cup to a half bush pot and drink that infusion. It's still pretty hot. Now, goldenrod's not too overly nasty. It's definitely got a green taste to it, like a, for lack of a better word, a chlorophyll taste to it, but it doesn't really have the afterbite or the acridness of yarrow. Once you put yarrow into an infusion like this, or bone set, and you add something else to it, maybe like mullein, so that you raise your body's core temperature a little bit and help things flow, then you are going to have to do something to sweeten this up, or you're going to have a hard time belting it down for sure. But with just the plain goldenrod, it's not really that bad. It's drinkable. It's not the most enjoyable tea in the world, but it's drinkable. And if you are experimenting with things like this, which is what you should do, if you're experimenting with a tea like this and you take goldenrod and you're really feeling fine, and all of a sudden you start to get a runny nose or something like that, and some mucus that you might have in your head is getting broken down and liquefied, it's probably the goldenrod doing that, so don't be alarmed. It ain't the best stuff in the world, but it ain't the worst. It's medicine. It's supposed to taste bad. That's what my mom always told me. Okay, folks, well, I'm Dave Canterbury with Self-Reliance Outfitters in the Pathfinder School, and I appreciate you joining me out here today for a quick video on the Woodsman's Expectorant, making a goldenrod infusion. I appreciate your support. I appreciate your views. I thank you for everything you do for our school, for our family, and for our business, all of our sponsors, instructors, affiliates, and friends, and I'll be back with another video as soon as I can. Thanks, guys.